The C-SPAN networks bring you long-form public affairs programming from the nation's capital and are a public service of your television provider. C-SPAN, created by cable.
Up, and we're going to keep things going. You should know that we've actually gotten communication from Chairman Schuster. He is in Baltimore. We had gotten notice that he was going this morning, and so we're just going to continue to stay in touch with his office, but I think we all know why he needs to be there. The Secretary, Secretary Menendez, actually started his comments paying respect to those who lost their lives, 7 at present, and those who were injured, more than 200. This is a significant incident, and again, we would want the chairman to be there taking care of business. With that, I'm going to call Senator Breaux, and he'll then bring on our next panel. Thank you.
Thank you all very much, and thank all of you who are attending with us this morning. Thank you for being here. We have another panel which I think will be very, very interesting and hopefully informative, and have an opportunity to ask them some questions. Thank all of you for participating. Thank you for the panelists. I served in this room for a very long time, and had I still been here, I'd have been chairman of this committee sitting right there. I actually tried to get the chairman to sit up there by the camera so he could really exert a lot of authority as chairman, but they didn't want to go along with that. But those were wonderful days and interesting days, and Trent in the previous panel mentioning about the difficulty in raising enough money to fund the transportation bill. I was in the Senate on the Finance Committee the last time we passed a tax increase at that great amount of 4.3 cents. And I cannot tell you the agony that we went through in trying just to raise it by 4.3 cents at a time when oil prices were going down. And had we passed a 10-cent tax at that time, gasoline at the pump would still have been lower than it was before the tax was passed because the price of oil was going down. But the only thing we could do back in 1993 was a 4.3 cent gas tax, which nobody really actually noticed very much. I cannot tell you how difficult that was from a political standpoint for members saying, I'm going to put my name on increasing a tax that everybody's going to see at the pump every day that's listed, gas tax, at every event they go to. I want to bring the panel up, but what they're going to be doing is talking about what's happening out there in the real world right now. I mean, it's incredible infrastructure needs that are out there. A lot of them are not being done, but there are a lot of them that are being done. There are a lot of projects that are actually out there in the private sector being funded by the private sector that are making a big difference in the infrastructure, and they should be supported. I'll take the privilege of just being the moderator and telling you about one project really quickly in particular. I happen to serve on the CSX Transportation Railroad Board. And right outside the Rayburn building over here, we got a project that we're doing, we're funding, we're paying for, that has now got all the permits after a very long period of time, struggling with the city, the district, the federal government, to get the permits to redo the Virginia Avenue Tunnel. The Virginia Avenue Tunnel was built in 110 years ago. It's a very old, obviously, track that goes right under the Democratic Club and all the way through the city to bring rail traffic all the way from the south, all the way up the New England corridor, all the way up to the northeast. But it's a huge bottleneck because it's a single track and you cannot put double-stack containers on the train because the tunnel's too low. You can only bring one train through there at a time, so it's a real huge, huge bottleneck. CSX is spending hundreds of millions of dollars, and the project is now started. We're actually starting the digging to do a double track to allow double-stack trains to go through that tunnel. So it'll be 2 trains that can go through at the same time, and both of them would be able to carry double-stack containers, which would eliminate the bottleneck. This is a multi-$100-million project that the railroad is doing, spending their own money. We spent over $2.3 billion in infrastructure last year just redoing tracks and redoing projects such as this. And this is just one example that I think we'll hear more of in our next panel. Let me introduce and start with Jennifer Omont. I hope I get all the names correctly. Jennifer, is that a correct pronunciation?
It is.
Close enough. Jennifer Omont, who is as Group General Manager of Trans-Saharan North America, which is doing incredible work. We're delighted to have you, Jennifer, and let you go ahead and make your comments. We'll let them and ask them to make their comments and summarize them, and then we'll have time for some questions. Jennifer, thank you for being with us.
Great, thank you, and it's such a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Secretary Slater and Squire Patton Boggs for being here, creating an opportunity to have this important forum, and perfect timing to do so. For background on Transurban, Transurban is an international infrastructure investor and toll road operator based in Melbourne, Australia. And what we do is finance, deliver, and operate networks of toll road projects around the world to improve mobility, address congestion, and enhance travel choices in major populated cities, including here in the greater Washington area, where we have a 45-mile network of express lanes that runs through Northern Virginia. We are pleased to be able to put public-private partnerships to work to be able to support both transportation and economic outcomes. And I'll start by saying, before we sort of focus in on the opportunities that public-private partnerships and look at specific projects, I do want to do a bit of a myth-busting here. We're talking today about sustainable funding, long-term funding for transportation. And too often, public-private partnerships are talked about in the context of alternatives to public revenue for transportation. And I want to be very clear in having had significant experience at Transurban with these partnerships and with the private activity bond program here in the U.S. and with TIFIA, that is not the case at all. We are not a substitute for funding. The AI estimates that there's about $250 billion worth of private capital out there that we could be putting to work to improve our infrastructure in this country. But the only way that we will be able to tap into that private capital is if we have sustainable funding on the government side to be able to put both of our resources to work to be able to drive transportation and economic outcomes. So I think it's important to bust that myth a bit. And I will tell you, when we look at specific projects, that bringing the best of the public sector and the private sector together, certainly it is worth it in terms of what we can deliver when we're looking at individual projects. And I want to highlight just for a moment our projects here in Northern Virginia, just on the other side of the river, both the 495 and 95 express lanes projects, to see what are the outcomes that you can get through these partnerships. We've constructed about a 45-mile network of high occupancy toll lanes that do provide an option for a faster and more reliable trip across 495 and 95 in the very congested Northern Virginia region. I imagine we have a few customers in the room, so I want to thank you very much for your business. And you are probably here today because you took the express lanes, and our non-customers are, in fact, probably still sitting on I-95 at the moment. But if we look about the economic outcomes and how we can use these major projects, this is about $3 billion worth of transportation improvements that have been delivered as a package of improvements with these projects. And the economic outcomes, those improvements have created $5 billion worth of economic opportunity in the Virginia market, including over $800 million worth of contracts for small women and minority-owned businesses. If you look at a year like 2010, our 495 Express Lane project was about 20% of Fairfax County's gross county product for that 1 year. So these projects really can move the needle when it comes to economic outcomes. If you look at our client, Virginia, really have to give Virginia credit, because by using a public-private partnership, they're able to, through the 495 and 95, get a return of 110 times their investment. By leveraging private capital, taxpayers got 110 times return on their investment as you look at upfront capital costs and the long-term operations and maintenance costs that are provided through these partnerships. So it's about economic outcomes and also transportation outcomes. And if you look at the Express Lanes network and what they're providing in terms of transportation outcomes, it's a really great story. 495 has been open to travelers since 2012, and 95 has just been open 4 months. And we've got some great data to show what these projects are doing to improve mobility in the region. If you look at March 2015 and customers who use the 95 express lanes that have been delivered as part of these projects, these customers are saving an average of about 20 to 30 minutes per trip to help get them to work. We have customers who are, especially on Thursdays and Fridays, saving as much as 2 hours a trip. So we've really gone a long way to improve the quality of life and get these travelers to work on time. We have about 610 bus trips across the Express Lanes network every day. And so by really looking at multimodal solutions like Hot Lanes, we've been able to deliver travelers savings, travel time savings, but also really unlocked and opened up the opportunity for bus travel and carpool travel in that corridor. On 95, our carpooling population is about 30% of our traffic are carpools. Since we've expanded and opened that Express Lanes network, 3 out of 5 carpoolers say they're ride-sharing even more often because of the reliability they get from that project. If you look at across the spectrum of travelers, you've got carpoolers, transit riders, toll-paying customers who have received benefit, and now we're looking at travelers even in the regular lanes who are choosing not to pay a toll. They're saving time on 95 of between 5 and 30 minutes per trip just because of the capacity improvements, safety, and mobility improvements that have been delivered as part of these projects. So again, I have to give our client all over the world, but particularly here in Virginia, it takes policymakers, it takes a lot of courage to be able to advance and try something bold and different through public-private partnerships. But as you can see, by doing so, you can deliver significant transportation and economic outcomes and really drive our economy. But we can't use these public-private partnerships unless policymakers make other bold decisions and put long-term funding in place to be able to support this model and really unlock private capital to help drive mobility and to drive our economy here in the U.S. Thank you.
Jennifer, thank you for your remarks. I'm sure there'll be questions. I'd like to present next panelist Mike Sharutz, who is Director of the High Performance Transportation Enterprise out of the Colorado Department of Transportation. Mike, we're glad you're here and look forward to your comments.
Thanks, Senator. Let's see. So I guess I'm here today representing the viewpoint of a state transportation provider. I've been the director for 5 years of a unit within the Colorado Department of Transportation, which provides mobility relief, is designed to provide mobility relief within the Metro Denver area. A little bit of context. Colorado, while it is not, one of the top 10 states in terms of population growth, has in the last 20 years doubled in size, most of it within the Metro Denver area. From that $8 million level, we are projected to grow another 4 to 5 million within the next 20 years. We've got important research centers around the metro area. It is an area that is critical not only to the state of Colorado, but to the region itself. This state has not increased its gas tax for 20 years, not unlike the federal situation. We are facing a horrendous financial crisis in terms of providing not only basic maintenance to the state transportation system, but to the critical mobility needs in the metro area. About 5 years ago, I participated in the creation of a piece of legislation that addressed, at that point, a critical bridge problem in the state. And amid much controversy, we were able to enact a license plate fee, which is earmarked for the repair of bridges in the state. We've made good use of that, and I think we've made some headway. To address long-term needs within the state, we tried to enact a pilot program, just a pilot program of miler-based user fee system. That lasted about 10 days in the legislature before it got dumped out of the bill. But a third part of the bill was the creation of the enterprise that I now direct, which is focused on innovative finance relief for the congestion problems in the area. Innovative finance was a code word for public-private partnerships, a concept brand new in our state as it was in the country and still is in many parts of the country. Jennifer described from her side of the table some critical elements which are difficult to explain to people sometimes. It is not a funding source, it is a financing source. We pay for the money that is provided by the private sector, sometimes more dearly than others, I think. But nevertheless, it is a funding source, the financing source that we make use of. 5 years into this process, we are about to open our first major project, about a 22-mile stretch between downtown Denver and the research centers in Boulder, the university town. It is a managed lane project. It is also a bus rapid transit project. We are going to compete with the automobiles in that lane with bus rapid transit service from Denver to Boulder. We were able to find companies from the private sector who were willing to participate in financing that project and even in this case undertake the revenue risk from the toll uncertainty that will exist for a while in that corridor. We've got in Colorado between $3 and $5 billion in transportation needs just to deal with the mobility issue in the metro area. We have one major project, a $1 billion plus project in procurement now, and we're looking forward to a successful result from that. We have problems on the interstates intersecting Denver north and south and east and west. And frankly, as I sit here, we have no idea how we're going to pay for those projects, a critical corridor being the Intermountain Corridor between Denver and the critically important recreational areas in Colorado, which are central to the economy of the state. We have tapped out cash reserves in this state that have been used for capital projects. We are counting on future federal revenues to finish some of those projects. We are at the bottom of the barrel, which I say in with a sense of urgency. My job becomes even more critical as the state itself runs out of funding, because we've got to look for ways to leverage what kind of revenue we can project from user fees, toll revenues on the network in the city. And I appreciate being part of this session. I hope we are collectively able to deliver the message where it needs to be delivered, that the time is critical, and I look forward to being part of the solution.
Thank you very much, Mike, for your comments and your contributions. I'm going to take a little bit out of order now, and I'm going to take my law partner and former member of Congress from the state of Georgia, Congressman Jack Kingston, to give his perspective on some of the things they're doing down in Georgia, and particularly in the Port Project area. And he's now with us, but these projects probably you had something to do with them back when you were in Congress yourself. So, Jack, why don't you go ahead and tell us about what's happening down there?
Well, thank you very much, Senator. I have to take a point of personal privilege that I really came here to lobby Jennifer on going ahead and getting a fast lane on 395, because I think we would all like to see that happen. And Mike, I do want to say my mother actually lives in Louisville, Colorado, and your toll road is great.
Thank you.
And I've driven it many times. It's such a great alternative to 36. But as a member of the House, I was on the Appropriations Committee and served in the House for 25 years. And probably the biggest infrastructure project in the state of Georgia right now is the deepening of the Savannah River. That project we lived and breathed for 13 years. And I want to put that in perspective for a minute. It took $40 million to get 4 federal agencies to sign off on it. We had to have the okay from EPA, Fish and Wildlife Corps of Engineers, and from NOAA. And along with that, we had to have state and stakeholders and all kinds of people who had an opinion on it. It took forever, and yet 300,000 jobs in the state of Georgia are involved almost directly with the port. 15,000 businesses, and of the 15,000 businesses that export in our state or import, either one, 70% of them have less than 500 employees. So it's always this thought, well, you know, port and export, that's the big folks, but that's not the case at all. But we had to jump through all kinds of hoops, as you can imagine, just to get the river 5 feet deeper. And we were going to 47 feet. When General Oglethorpe sailed up the river in 1733, it was 12. So we've been playing in the mud for nearly 200 years down there. This was not some new concept. But the global part of this is that during that period of time, China built a port from start to finish that was bigger than the port of Savannah. Savannah is the 4th largest port in the United States of America. But if we're going to compete in the marketplace internationally, we can't have such a slow, tedious, really uncertain working, I guess, permitting process. The state of Georgia was ready, had skin in the game. The project, by the way, went from about $250 million to over $650 million. But the state was there dollar for dollar for their share, always ready to kick in. And I think that's important. But now that, and the point is, of course, to be able to be deep enough to get the post-Panamax ships really is what we're focusing on now. Panama Canal was supposed to be finished 2014. Fortunately for us in Savannah, they got delayed, and so that kind of helped us. But it is part of the world trade. But the second part of it now that we're in is railroad access, railroad crossing, sure that there aren't delays, and then, of course, truck lanes. And so now we have to get back to traditional surface transportation issues, and that's one of the things that we're working on. From a state level, the state of Georgia just passed a transportation bill. Congressman DeFazio talked about what Virginia had done. Georgia is a red state. Georgia is a Republican governor, Republican House, Republican Senate, but the state legislature increased the hotel-motel tax $5 a night. It's a pretty big slug if you think about it, but there had to be some funding mechanisms. But beyond that, one of the things that I can say, I served in the state legislature and I served in Congress. From a legislator's standpoint, in my opinion, you need to have leadership that we really don't have on a complete level. And by that I mean leadership from the White House to the courthouse. Everybody has to pass the baton. And what I have seen from the other side, from the voting side of this issue, is you get transportation type people, whether they're directly involved with cars or railroads or highway contractors and so forth, but they tend to call on members of the highway transportation committees. They don't call on somebody from a health care committee, and yet health care is very involved in transportation. They don't call on somebody from the agriculture committee, but agriculture depends on good roads and transportation as well. And one of the things that I would say that we, as those who support more transportation funding or a better vision, you got to call on all 435 members of the House, because calling on the transportation committee members, and I'd say Bill Schuster is probably my best friend in the House, but they live and breathe it. They're for it. They're going to make it happen. I mean, Pete DeFazio and Schuster, they'll come up with the program. They can do it in a half a day, but they've got to have 218 votes. And unless we are working on the entire Congress, then it's not going to happen. So that would be kind of my report from my little old foxhole. And Senator, I appreciate your
No, thank you very much, Jack. Let me just ask a quick question before, because I know you have to leave. One of the arguments is that since the Congress eliminated earmarks on special projects in members' districts, and that's been a real impediment to having projects that are essential being authorized and approved. Do you think the idea will ever come back to allowing those type of endeavors by members?
I think that what happened with the earmark debate is it got out of hand numerically and it got out of hand in substance, but what it really is a member-directed project. And traditionally, when Bud Schuster held the gavel that we've already mentioned, you know, he'd go to individual members of the House and say, what do you need in your district? Well, you'd already heard from all your mayors and county commissioners and your governor and your state legislators, so you kind of had an idea. And so you could say, well, there's, you know, we have some projects. They add up to about $25 million. Now, that's not paying for the entire project, but just the federal match that the state was ready to go for. And then, and he'd say, well, you're not going to get $25 million. Well, what can I get, Mr. Chairman? Well, you get 20. Well, let me go back and shop it back home. And that's where I think a lot of the leadership came from, because suddenly that county commissioner, that city councilman, everybody had a buy-in. And you went back and you were going to vote for the bill. But right now, it's sort of an academic thing. It gets real fuzzy. Okay, we passed the transportation bill. Not sure who actually makes the decision. All that money might go to Ohio. Not to pick on Ohio, I'm just saying it might go elsewhere. And that's what a legislator cares about. What's going to come back to my district. So I do think that there needs to be a way to address member priorities as a way of growing the vote.
When Bud Schuster was chairman, every highway in Pennsylvania became a 6-lane highway. Thank you very much, Jack. We're certainly going to excuse you. I know you have another thing you have to get to. And we'd like to welcome now our next presenter, Chris Guthridge. Oh, no, Mike. Let's do Mike. Mike Sharoots. Sorry, Mike, we did it. Sorry, Chris.
I'm going to cede my time.
We only let you do it once. Chris Sharoots, Chris Guthridge. Chris Guthridge is a project director on infrastructure development for the Skanska Infrastructure Development. We're delighted to have you here and look forward to your thoughts.
Thank you very much, sir. So really to introduce Skanska, it's a Swedish company, 127 years of pedigree. It's one of the world's largest developer and contractor companies. It's a champion for sustainable infrastructure. It drives the way the company sort of looks at its opportunities. It has 10,000 employees in the US, and the US is our #1 growth market. We're just completing a 2020 sort of 5-year business plan cycle, but actually within the infrastructure development side, we think 10 years ahead. And this is a hugely competitive market. Lots and lots of international companies who are all vying to get the next opportunity. And so, we need to be teaming some 2 to 3 years ahead before formal procurements actually start. We're here and we want the opportunity to invest in America's continued growth, but that also includes workforce development. It includes minority supply chain development, because in reality, we cannot grow the way that we want to unless we can actually sort of create, these centers of excellence. But we need a reliable program of projects, both at federal, state, and sort of local levels. We want an opportunity to be able to sort of show the value that can be created by using innovative procurement and financing means. We want fairness and transparency. Don't blame public-private partnerships for shortfalls in permitting and right-of-way acquisition procedures. We want decisiveness. Once you set a path, you need to stick to it. And last but not least, this is all about execution, and it's execution in a timely manner. And just to sort of put a personal side to it, when I was the project director for the Midtown Tunnel, when we won the bid for this sort of $2 billion project down in Hampton Roads, a really large construction worker came up to me and gave me a big hug. And he said, "Thank you for assuring my job for the next 5 years." And that's the reality of it, is the impact on families and, you know, their breadwinners and so on of unreliable project streams. And just very quickly to sort of talk about the Midtown Tunnel, with which I was very proudly associated. This is a huge technical undertaking in the Elizabeth River and Hampton Roads area of Southern Virginia. This is a public-private partnership. This cannot be done without one side or the other. This is a 5,100-foot immersed concrete tube tunnel. 11 segments, each of them is 16,000 tons. It was fabricated up in Sparrows Point, in Baltimore, and then the segments floated down the Chesapeake to the Elizabeth River. It's then laid, each of these segments laid in 100 feet of water with a 1-inch tolerance. That's the sort of engineering that you get with these, you know, mega projects. And we can't do projects like this without things like, you know, federal loans. The TIFIA loan was a very key part of the financing for this project. What would we see as critical success factors? Firstly, joint stakeholder management. I think we've learned a lot about stakeholders and the representative, you know, talking about getting the whole house on side. But actually, this is much more than that. This is about getting, you know, all the sort of political sort of spectrum, and, you know, the taxpayers and the users of these assets, going through an educative process. And actually, I'd like to applaud what Colorado has actually done in terms of, you know, the approach that they've had, driven by the governor, to actually get public outreach out there. It's utterly critical to these projects. And if you don't have a project champion, that's a real issue. You know, without a project champion, many of these projects will just flounder. And last but not least is just to make the point, DBE, you know, disadvantaged business enterprises and SWAM. I mentioned it earlier on, but just for the Midtown project alone, we have some 28 DBEs and 124 SWAM vendors already on board. It's a very key area of these projects, is not just creating and constructing the project, but actually bringing up the community around it. Thanks.
Chris, thank you very much for that perspective. And next we'd like, as our presenter, Dr. Oliver McGee, who's a good friend of the Secretary and Slater, and served with the Secretary in the Department of Transportation. He's now at Howard University and a professor there, and will share some thoughts, I think, Doctor, on technology and maybe even some positive train control thoughts.
Yes. Thank you, Secretary Slater, for having me here, and Senator Breaux and Senator Lott. I really want to congratulate Squire Peyton Boggs for recognizing Transportation Infrastructure Week in this fashion. It's so very, very, very important. Transportation, in my eyes, and many others, is about economic choices. It's about moving people, ideas, and things, as Secretary Slater oftentimes said. But more importantly, I'm a mathematician, an engineer, and a scientist, civil, aerospace, and mechanical engineer, as a matter of fact. And so I like to put things in mathematical formulas. Competitiveness equals risk, uncertainty, and growth. And I learned that from a great economic teacher, an absentee teacher, Frank Knight at the University of Chicago. He has a great book on the subject. And when you look at risk, it's about what we know. And uncertainty is about what we don't know. It's our innovation enterprise. And growth is about jobs. And more importantly, how we remain competitiveness. How do we remain competitive in the United States and in the world? And when you're looking at growth, you have to start thinking about how you're investing in technology. And how do you employ it? Positive train control is about taking advanced technology that was developed 45 years ago and implementing it today. We're basically running a 19th century railroad system in the Northeast. 50% of positive train control has been implemented between New York and Boston, but only 5% has been implemented between New York and Washington, D.C. and through the Philadelphia corridor. Without that employment of technology, lives are lost. So oftentimes what I do as an academician is I look at what are we looking at in the public understanding of science and technology. And oftentimes that's what science and technology and transportation is all about, understanding transportation in a science and technology realm. There are really 7 grand technologies that we're trying to develop in transportation technologies. One is information technologies. You've heard from the folks at ITS are really saying we're trying to actuate and sense transportation and provide information so you can engage it. The other technology is biotechnology, and that's looking at how health issues incorporate and couple with transportation. We want a healthy transportation enterprise, but we also want healthy people engaging healthy transportation. Then there's also advanced wireless and communications. Transportation is always about mega-scale engineering, as Chris was outlining here, big, large projects. But transportation is also getting smaller. We are actually doing virtual transportation more often than we are physical transportation. So when we have these wireless communication devices, we're moving people and ideas and things virtually. With telecommuting, virtual offices, that's transportation, but it involves wireless communications and advances of that. Microtechnology. Microtechnology is about computing transportation, computing the choices and decisions that are involved in transportation. Researchers are now looking much further, 50 years out, in nanotechnology, where things get very, very small. And oftentimes what I was sharing with Secretary Slater as his advisor is we're going to be looking at molecular computing, where we'll be looking at 750 times faster than the high-performance computing we have now. Why do we need to compute transportation? Because we're trying to figure out the traffic patterns in the Northeast Corridor for daily flight as well as now rail systems. The derailment today that we're faced is costing our economy $100 million a day. So do we want to advance in these advanced technologies, or do we want to lose $100 million a day and get into the business of moving derailed trains off the tracks instead of moving people? Cognotechnology is the 6th technology that's really looking at advances in brain research, and this is so important in transportation. It deals with the human factors. Human factors is really what positive train control is about. But when we look at air travel, Southeast Asia is expected to be the largest growth in air travel by 2050. But we have close to well over 1,100 people who have died in airplane crashes in the last year, since March 8, 2014, which was the inception of what? MH370. We're still trying to find the aircraft. And also, in other parts of the region of the world, we were impacted by Germanwings Airlines, where we had to look at the psychological factors that were involved inside what we call a cockpit post 9/11. What is a locked cockpit door and who belongs in it? Should we bring the navigator back so that we can make sure that when we lock that cockpit door, we have very strong human factors and cognitive issues, and looking at psychological factors of pilots and also personnel inside the aircraft cockpit. And then finally, we need to look at elder technology. As in the Western societies, as we get to an older society, how do we engage with moving people, ideas, and things, the mobility issues in engagement of transportation? Finally, I'd like to tap into what we're looking at in the government-university industry partnership that really involves not only developing the advances in transportation in these technologies, which involves a lot of investment, a lot of uncertainty management, but more importantly, it deals with workforce development. How do we gauge a new supply of scientists and engineers to understand these advances in technology, engage them? More importantly, as we look at demographicships and heightened engagements who are actually engaging in transportation. And this will involve training many, many scientists and engineers, not only in America, but also across the world, particularly when we look at the Southeast Asia region. For flying, we have to look at pilot shortages, but how are we training those pilots for advances in technologies, say for an Airbus or a Boeing aircraft, which has a glass cockpit? And then how do we look at those technologies that are developed in the western side of the world and engage with the eastern side of the world when you're basically trying to fly an aircraft. Imagine, for example, if you were flying an aircraft that was made in China and it was largely in a society of Mandarin Chinese, and you're English trying to fly that aircraft on a digital aircraft. So it would be very difficult in the empathy to try to advance with that cultural issue involved in that. That's what we're talking about in the new age of workforce development as we go forward. In closing, I agree with Frank Knight. I think Frank Knight would probably say that infrastructure week and transportation is very important, because he would be saying, how risky are we taking our risk? And how certain are we about our uncertainties? And how will we grow the transportation enterprise for 2050 and beyond? It's about moving people, ideas, and things, both physically and virtually. Thank you.
Dr. McGee, thank you very much for those thoughts and insight. Our final presenter will be Beverly Swain Staley, who's the head and president and CEO of a project right near here that we've all visited probably many, many times, the Union Station Redevelopment Corporation, and is here to tell us what they're doing and what they've done. Beverly, thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, I want to thank you very much for the privilege of being here today. I always say I have one of the best jobs in the world. I have the privilege right now of working on Washington Union Station and preparing it for what we call the Second Century Project. Just a little bit of history. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the building and probably the challenges that it presents. But it was in about 1901, thanks to the leadership of the Senate, Senator McMillan, saw the need to revitalize Washington, D.C., and we had the McMillan Plan, and Washington Union Station was built as an anchor to that plan. In the early 1980s, it had fallen into major disrepair, as had rail travel, but again, fortunately to the leadership of Congress, the USRC, Union Station Redevelopment Corporation, was established as a public-private partnership with the goal of reinvigorating and rebuilding that station as a multimodal transportation center and also a commercial center that would revitalize the neighborhoods. And I think we can see 30 years later that it certainly achieved those goals. It is now time, however, to go into the next century and once again rebuild and build a new transit-oriented development and link the eastern side of the city and the neighborhoods of Capitol Hill, Noma, and the downtown. And so 2 years ago, Amtrak announced its vision plan for 2012, and there are a number of partners involved in that plan, including USRC, we're a nonprofit, and 2 developers, as well as the city and other regional entities. So just to briefly give you a vision for that plan, it entails, of course, preserving the historic building, but completely rebuilding all of the rail infrastructure behind the facility. New rail yard, new catenary. Much of that infrastructure is 100 years old now, and it's not working very well, and certainly not what the Northeast Corridor needs in order to address the issues and provide for long-term transportation for the next 100 years. So redeveloping this station is critical to Amtrak plans and critical to actually serving the Northeast Corridor. Washington Union Station is also the busiest metro station in the system, even though it's not a transfer station and it only serves one line. Metro, fortunately, also has plans to expand the metro services there. We also have a very active bus station there now. We serve over 37 million people a year in Washington Union Station. To give you some comparison, I like to call it the 4th airport. Their largest airport in the region serves less than 25 million people. So it's a very busy place, and I'm sure you're all very familiar. It's bursting at the seams. It's still a great place to be, but we definitely need to take it to the next evolution. So that's what we've been working on, and we are deep into the planning phases. We hope that next year, actually, Amtrak begins construction in the current concourse, although the full build-out, which will take us, conservatively speaking, let's say 20 years, the plan would be to do the inside of the station in the first phase, which we're working on that design now. Amtrak would completely rebuild the east side of the rail yard, and then a private developer will literally build a transit-oriented development with hotels, homes, offices over top. Then we would build the west side, and again, the developer that would then complete the west side. So we're essentially not only creating a new transportation system in Washington, but also creating a new neighborhood. So it's really a very, very exciting project. Obviously, to do a project like that, it's going to take a very long time, and we need a stable source of funding, and we need certainty of funding. We have proceeded, however, for the past couple of years and into the planning and NEPA and early design. And literally the way we've been able to do that, because our partners consist of private developers in Amtrak, public-private, and a nonprofit. We literally, at the beginning of the year, sit down and look at what we want to do and what we need to do to keep the project on schedule. And invariably, at least one partner does not know in that fiscal year if they're going to have the money to put up to fund the project. Fortunately, one of the other partners at the table, including the nonprofit, has been able to say, well, we will front you the money this year so that we can keep the project going. That's how we've been able to get into the planning. Obviously, that works when we're talking about tens of millions of dollars, but no one has the deep pockets when we get into design and we're talking about tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars. So within the next couple of years, we're going to be at a place where we need to know certainty of funding and stable funding. We want this to be and plan for it to be a significant public-private partnership. We'll have a number of options to fund it, but we can't ask the private sector to step up and to be there if we can't make the commitments for the public funding. And certainty, they absolutely need certainty. We obviously also cannot embark on this project and the large and expensive phases that we have. We certainly can't start to build a rail yard and stop building it halfway through, or start to build the development of the concourses from the private sector and stop it halfway through. So I think we have very close to here a great example of why we need flexibility in funding. We need options where the public sector and the private sector can work together to finance projects, as well as stability for funding. So I'm confident. We had the leadership in 1901 and 1981, the vision and the creativity to make sure that Washington Union Station was one of the most iconic multimodal transportation centers in the world, and I'm sure that we're going to do that again. But we definitely need to step up with funding sources, creativity, and flexibility.
Beverly, thank you very much for that update on a very important project, and thank all of the panelists. Let me open it up. If anyone has a question, any of our panelists, they are welcome to ask them. Yes, sir, in the back. Speak up a little bit.
Oh, sorry.
I'm old and deaf.
Maybe this is...
Technology the deficit.
Mathematical formula to the...
Just speak up. We can hear.
Okay. Beverly, I'm just curious, this may be overly simplistic, but how much of the project is expected to be public funding and how much is it going to come from value capture or the private side?
Well, we've just started the master development plan. Hired Grimshaw and BBB. We're also starting the NEPA process. So we're hoping in the next year to 18 months as we go through that to have the details. But as I mentioned, we have multiple, I think, potential sources of funding. We are currently, as a nonprofit, funded primarily from parking revenue, for example. As I said, we also have the bus company, and bus companies are paying. So I think we're going to have multiple areas that we can monetize. But the reason that sort of flexibility is going to be so critical is to be able to sort of bring these different kinds of sources together and be able to do a financing package. And so that's what we're working on now, and we don't have the answers. And one of the critical pieces is going to know how much money we could expect for the public parts, for example.
Let me throw out a question about, it seems we always hear how other countries and passenger rail transportation like China and Japan and some of the European models are averaging 150 miles an hour on brand new sleek modern trains, and we don't see that in the United States. What are we doing differently in this country, or what are they doing differently in these other areas that we might learn from? Any thoughts from anybody? Chris, maybe your international perspective, or anybody? Why are they doing it differently from us, and is it more successful than we're doing it here in this country?
I used to commute from Oxfordshire into the city of London every day using the Great Western Line. And for those who sort of know their history, Isambard Brunel, Kingdom Brunel actually sort of designed and built that railway. And the whole point about it, you know, this is back in the 19th century. The whole point was it was literally to give you as smooth a ride as you can take. You run the high-speed 125s of trains up and down there. I mean, the point is, this is technology which, was in existence, in the 19th century. There is no reason why. I mean, it's a lot of investment, but there's no question that you can create.
What is it, because the investment over there is from the governmental sources as opposed to the private sector, or combination, or what?
This is private investment in the railways.
I take it the private passenger rail system pays for itself with the ridership in those areas?
Well, you hope.
Sorry?
I mean, you hope. What I'd say if we were looking at public-private partnerships for improving rail systems in this country, particularly actually on the heavy transit or sort of light rail, in particular light rail. I mean, the reality is that these projects don't pay for themselves from the actual sort of fare box itself. And in reality, the actual sort of risk of the revenues themselves still sits with the public sector. But you can achieve an enormous amount with both a sort of partnership of both the public and the private side.
Obviously, one of the problems with Amtrak doesn't pay for itself, not anywhere close. Jennifer, you have any comments on how we're doing the Virginia projects, I-95 and 495? I mean, from a public-private partnership. I mean, you're a private company, but tell us, I mean, how are we doing it as far as the funding operations?
From our perspective, these projects, partnerships are successful when you can align commercial objectives with policy objectives. And that is a very difficult thing to do, and it's not suited for every project. But we think the case of 95 and 495, we have that alignment where from a policy outcome perspective, you heard me talk about the time savings, the increased transit, the jobs, the economic outcomes that have come from those projects. And from a commercial perspective, we're very pleased that 495 is on solid financial footing, and that 95 has come out of the box, in a solid position, so that we can get a return for our shareholders as well. That's what we, I think, need here in the U.S. And Chris could speak to this as well. In our sector, we need more examples in the U.S. of projects that have struck that alignment and been successful and delivered outcomes on both sides. I think, those kinds of case studies will give, I hope, policymakers, encouragement to try these kinds of public-private partnerships and to be able to move projects forward like we've seen in other markets around the world.
Any questions from the audience? Let me ask one more, maybe to Dr. McGee. Oliver, you mentioned positive train control, which obviously has been in the news because of the recent derailment in Philadelphia area, tragic derailment, and the argument that had you had positive train control, it would have been able to stop the train before the accident. How are other countries doing on PTC? I mean, do they have it in place? Do you know, or are we the only ones lagging behind? Or can you comment on that?
Sure. Positive train control is 45-year-old technology, as I said, but we are dealing with trying to turn a train at 50 miles per hour slower than the cars on I-95 parallel to it in a turn that was designed for freight system. So we have to separate the freight rail from the commercial rail. Commercial rail is largely a straight line, and when you look at maglev, it's floating. So it really challenges us as the United States. Are we really ready to do mega-scaled engineering development in a funding model like in MAP 21 that has 27 increments as we step forward? It's very difficult for private enterprise to anticipate, make investments, risky investments, to partner with the government that is really taking baby steps in increments for mega-scale engineering development like Chris is talking about. When you go in a straight line and you have advances in high-speed rail technology, then we may not be talking about positive train control, but further advances in technologies I talked about in information systems and wireless systems and digital and computing technologies that could put a glass operation system inside of a train system, much like what we see in aircraft. I had the privilege of traveling from Paris to Belgium and back, and I was on that train and had a glass of wine, and it never even shook. I said, this is better than flying in Southwest Airlines. We look at flying in this country like we're flying on the Greyhound. How many people enjoy engaging in airport these days? Baggage fees, you got to hold onto your wallet while you get off the out of the cab in the National Airport. Everything is feed to death. We're really basically, it's not an enjoyable experience. We don't have the Pan Am of flying anymore. And right now, we're looking at $100 million a day in cost. I always say that we will develop the mega-scale engineering technologies and do this when we're tired of the pain. But more importantly, in a serious matter, this is lives lost. I think our transportation enterprise is in trouble when it loses 7 lives or over 1,100 lives, like we lost in air travel in the last year, and that's the most in 6 decades. So I'm always mindful about that. It's about safety, but at the same time, when we do advances in technology, we get a safer transportation enterprise. Secretary Slater used to always say, safety is our North Star in transportation. But as we engineers and scientists develop these new technologies, we have to deploy them so that we can become more safer and keep advancing the transportation enterprise forward. Because everything we do today is an economic choice. And every single morning, we have to make a choice on the transportation system. And that engages us every day. Congress is doing incremental analysis because that's how they bring home the bacon. It's one of the most discretionary areas in the budget, and that's how we say to our constituents, looky here what I brung home to you, right? A new bridge, a new parking lot, a new train, a new curve in the highway, another lane in the highway, but that's all incremental analysis. But as contrary to advances in engineering, which is a mega-scale project, I will close. When was the last big transportation project we've done in this country? I think I can remember the Big Dig in Boston, but that was just about it. And when we do these big projects, it engages the public understanding of science and technology, and we have more hope in the transportation system. And that's what Infrastructure Week is about this week, providing that hope.
Well, thank you, Dr. McGee, and I'd like to thank our entire panel. Chairman Schuster left Baltimore, and it is tied up in traffic, appropriately for a transportation conference, but I will thank this panel very much for their presentations and for all of our audience. Let me just bring up Secretary, let me ask Secretary Slater to come up and close the program. Thank you, Rodney.
And Senator, we'd like to thank you for the great job you did moderating the panel. Let's give the Senator a round of applause. Just a couple of points to close out. You should know that coming into this room, we actually asked the chairman and the ranking member if we could sit in these chairs. You know, they're a lot more, you know, they're elevated. Can you imagine sitting up there and that's the thing. They told us, can you imagine? No, you cannot sit up there. You have to sit here. So we're here. A little power thing, but we've enjoyed the experience. Let me also say, clearly we've learned some things. I did not know, Beverly, that we have as many passengers moving through Union Station, 37 million, and more than the number of passengers moving through the largest airport in the region. I mean, that's fascinating. I did not know that. And then clearly, Oliver, as is always the case, helping us to really appreciate the importance of science and math and technology as it relates to transportation. I always like and enjoy our conversations. Chris, thank you for letting us know that this is a ripe market. I don't think we always know that. I don't think we always fully appreciate that. And so thank you for saying that. And then, Michael, when I look at you and when I look at Jen, I think about Congressman Kingston. Did you see what he did? He took care of some personal business, right? He said to Jen, he said, take care of I-395. And then he said to Mike, My mother really appreciates you for that. I mean, this is our partner at the firm, so he took care of some personal business, and we acknowledge that too. And hopefully all of you have taken care of a little personal business as well, because clearly we've got the movers and shakers who can get things done. Let me close with this. Regina Harper mentioned her father. And if I may, just as a point of personal privilege, I'd like to mention him as well. His name is Bobby Harper. And Bobby owned Ford dealerships, and we used to call him Bobby Harper Ford. And as you know, President Clinton served as governor for a number of years, and he got a chance to appoint Bobby Harper to the Highway Commission twice. These are 10-year terms. So he served 20 years as a member of the Arkansas Highway and Transportation Commission. And when I came on board in 1987, he was the chairman. And one piece of advice I got from one of the members was, do you want to be successful on this commission? And I said, I'd love to be. And he said, all you have to remember is how to count to 3. And I said, that's interesting. I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, there are 5 members on this board. It's constitutionally independent. So once we're appointed by the governor, we can basically do whatever we want. And all of the money runs through this commission. He said, so if you can get 2 other members to go along with you, then you can do practically what you want to do. You know, that's legal and that sort of thing, and if we've got the money. And then I had a conversation with Bobby Harper, and we talked, and he said, I represent the richest part of the state. And he said, you are from the Delta, the most economically challenged part of our state. He said, I think we should follow the governor's advice, and that is we should always try to count to 5. That's a lesson in power. And I really think that's what the senators have been talking about as they've been leading these panels. They've been saying, let's go to all of the members, not just those on the committee, but to all of them. Let's, as Republicans, go to Democrats, and as Democrats, go to Republicans. Let's, as members of the public sector, go to members of the private sector, and as members of the private sector, go to the public sector. So tell Bobby that he gave not only me a good lesson, but we've heard that lesson espoused in this meeting today. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.
The C-SPAN networks bring you long-form public affairs programming from the nation's capital and are a public service of your television provider. C-SPAN, created by cable.